My life has always been defined by a certain comfortable anonymity. I live in a mid-sized apartment on the 14th floor, a space that smells faintly of floor wax and the cold air that leaks through the window frames in November. I am a man of habits. I drink my coffee black, I wear charcoal sweaters because they don't demand attention, and I work as a data verifier for a logistics firm. My job is to ensure that numbers match other numbers. It is a quiet, bloodless existence, and for a long time I found peace in that. The television in my living room is an older model, a heavy black rectangle that sits on a pine stand. I don't watch it for the content, really. I watch it for the texture. I leave it on in the background while I cook, while I read, and while I stare at the city lights. It provides a layer of ambient noise that fills the gaps in my own thoughts. For years, commercials were just a blur of saturated colors and upbeat music. They were a nuisance, a frantic shouting for attention that I had learned to tune out. They spoke to a you that wasn't me, a you who wanted a new SUV, or a you who needed a specific brand of laundry detergent. I was invisible to them, and they were invisible to me. But 3 weeks ago, the frequency changed. It began on a rainy Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, slicing an apple. The television was murmuring in the next room, a news broadcast followed by a commercial break. Usually, the volume stays consistent, but this time, the audio seemed to drop into a lower, more resonant register. A voice spoke. It wasn't the usual high-energy pitchman. It was a calm, measured voice. It sounded like a man standing just behind my shoulder. "You've been thinking about the radiator in the hallway, haven't you?" the voice asked. I stopped slicing. The knife stayed embedded in the core of the apple. I hadn't been watching the screen, but the question was so specific that it felt like a physical touch. I had, in fact, spent 10 minutes that morning staring at the radiator. It had developed a small, rhythmic hiss, a sound like a dying lung. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't looked up repair services. I had simply thought about it while I brushed my teeth. I walked into the living room. On the screen, there was no brand name, no logo, just a slow-motion shot of a glass of water sitting on a wooden table. The water was vibrating ever so slightly. "It's not just the sound," the voice continued, smooth and cool as silk. "It's the feeling that something is hollow. You feel it when you wake up at 4 a.m. That hollow space in the center of the room. We have something for that." Then, the screen cut to a bright, jarring advertisement for a local car dealership. The loud music returned. The screaming text. The usual chaos. I stood in the center of my rug, holding the half-sliced apple. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy thud. It was a coincidence, I told myself. Everyone has a radiator that hisses. Everyone feels a little hollow at 4 a.m. That's just the nature of living in a city. Marketers are experts at universal truths. They throw a wide net, and I just happened to be in the path of this one. I went back to the kitchen. I finished the apple. But the air in the apartment felt different. It felt observed. The next evening, I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through a book of old photographs. I wasn't really looking at them. I was just letting the pages flip past my thumb. The television was on, the volume low. A commercial came on. This time, there was no image at all. The screen was a soft, neutral gray. "The photograph on page 42, the voice said. It was the same voice. Quiet. Intimate. The one of the girl in the yellow dress at the lake. You're wondering if she remembers the smell of the pine needles, or if she only remembers the coldness of the water." I dropped the book. It landed face down on the carpet. Page 42. My sister. 1994. The girl in the yellow dress. I had been staring at that exact photo for the last 3 minutes. I hadn't scanned it. I hadn't uploaded it. It was a physical photograph in a physical book that had been in a box under my bed for 5 years. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I watched the gray screen. I waited for it to sell me something. A digital scanning service? A memory-keeping app? A funeral home? But it sold nothing. The gray screen lingered for 5 more seconds, long enough for me to hear the sound of my own shallow breathing reflected back at me. Then, it cut to a vibrant, noisy ad for a brand of light beer. I turned the television off. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat in the dark for a long time. I looked at the black screen. I could see my own reflection in the glass, a pale, blurred shape. I wondered if the screen could see me back. Not just my face, not just my living room. I wondered if it was looking at the things I hadn't said out loud, the things I hadn't even admitted to myself. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation. Smart TVs have cameras. They have microphones. They have algorithms that can predict your mood based on your browsing history. But I didn't have a smart TV. This was an analog-era box connected to a basic cable line. I stood up and went to the window. I looked out at the thousands of other windows in the city. Each one was a small, glowing rectangle of blue light. I wondered if the people behind those windows were hearing about their own radiators, if they were being asked about their own sisters in yellow dresses, or was it just me? I reached behind the TV stand and pulled the plug from the wall. The little red standby light flickered and died. There, I whispered. Now it's just a box. I went to bed. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. I listened to the hiss of the radiator. It sounded louder now. It sounded like a whisper. I fell into a thin, restless sleep. I dreamt of gray screens. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was silent. I felt a sense of triumph. I had cut the cord. I had reclaimed my privacy. I went to the bathroom to wash my face. As I reached for the towel, I heard a sound from the living room. It was a faint, electronic hum. I walked slowly toward the door. My hands were cold. The television was on. The plug was still lying on the floor, 3 inches away from the outlet. I could see it clearly in the morning light. The black cord was coiled like a dead snake. But the screen was glowing. It was that same soft, neutral gray. "You look tired, Mark," the voice said. It sounded concerned. It sounded like a friend. "You should sit down. We have so much more to talk about." I didn't move. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, the cold air from the hallway floor chilling my bare feet. I looked at the black cord on the carpet, then back at the glowing gray screen. The physics of the situation should have paralyzed me with terror, but instead, I felt a strange, hollowed-out calm. It was the feeling you get when you realize the nightmare isn't ending because you aren't actually asleep. The television didn't flicker. The image was stable, a perfect, unmoving void of neutral light. "How are you doing this?" I asked. My voice was a dry croak. I didn't expect an answer, but the silence that followed felt expectant, like a theater audience waiting for the lead actor to find his mark. "It isn't about the wires, Mark," the voice replied. It was louder now, filling the corners of the room. It didn't sound like it was coming from the speakers. It sounded like it was vibrating the very air inside my lungs. "The wires were just a courtesy, a way to help you transition, but we've moved past that now. We're in the subtext." I backed away, retreating into the kitchen. I needed a barrier. I needed the hard, familiar edges of my countertop. I grabbed my phone from the charging dock, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I wanted to call someone, my mother, my supervisor, a technician, anyone who could provide a tether to a world where electronics required electricity. But as my thumb hovered over the contacts, the screen of the phone didn't show my wallpaper, the icons for my apps. The little squares that represented my connection to the outside world shimmered and dissolved. The phone's screen turned that same, hauntingly neutral gray. A small text box appeared at the bottom. It wasn't a notification. It was a line of dialogue, scrolling slowly from right to left. "Remain calm, Mark. Stress is a product of resistance. Would you like to hear about the shoes you bought 3 years ago? The ones you hid in the back of the closet because they made too much noise on the hardwood?" I dropped the phone into the sink. It hit the porcelain with a sharp clack, but the gray light continued to spill out of it, illuminating the wet surfaces of the dishes. I was being hunted by my own history. I spent the next 4 hours in a state of suspended animation. I didn't leave the apartment. I felt that if I opened the front door, the hallway would no longer be there, that the world outside had been replaced by a gray, digital fog. I moved through my home like a stranger. Every object seemed to be vibrating with a hidden meaning. The toaster, the microwave, the digital clock on the oven. They weren't tools anymore. They were witnesses. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands clasped together to stop the shaking. I tried to think logically. Data mining, I thought. Advanced neurolinguistic programming. Maybe a leak in the gas line is causing hallucinations. But the logic felt thin, like a sheet of paper trying to stop a flood. Around noon, the hunger came. It was a sharp, physical ache that felt grounded and real. I reached for a box of cereal on top of the fridge. I didn't look at the packaging. I just wanted something to crunch, something to prove my senses were still mine. I poured the flakes into a bowl. As I reached for the milk, I glanced at the side of the cereal box. Usually, the back of the box is filled with games for children, mazes, word searches, colorful mascots. But this box was different. The cardboard was a flat, matte gray. In the center of the box, printed in a clean, sans serif font, was a single paragraph. You're wondering if the milk has gone sour. It hasn't. But the way you look at the expiration date is the same way you look at your own reflection in the morning. You're calculating how much time is left before you're no longer useful. Why not try our new supplement? It eliminates the need for calculations. I pushed the bowl away. The flakes looked like dead skin. The commercials were no longer personal. They were becoming internal. They were using my own anxieties as a sales pitch for a product that didn't exist. Or perhaps the product was the anxiety itself. I stood up and went to the bathroom. I needed to see myself. I needed to confirm that I was still a physical entity, separate from the gray light. I turned on the faucet and let the water run over my wrist. Cold. It was very cold. I looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror. For a split second, I saw my face, my tired eyes, the stubble on my chin, the slight sag of my shoulders. Then, the reflection shifted. My face didn't change, but a translucent layer of text began to crawl across my forehead, mirrored and backwards, yet perfectly legible in my mind. Optimize your self-image. You spend 12 minutes a day regretting the words you said to your father in 2012. That is 73 hours a year of wasted processing power. Click here to unsubscribe from regret. I screamed. It wasn't a loud scream, more of a choked, desperate gasp. I struck the mirror with the heel of my hand. The glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. It just felt soft, like the surface of a liquid. My hand sank an inch into the reflection, and I felt a faint, static hum vibrate through my bones. I pulled my hand back. The mirror smoothed over instantly. The voice from the living room spoke again, louder now, echoing off the bathroom tiles. Don't be dramatic, Mark. This is what you wanted, isn't it? To be understood? To be seen? You've spent 40 years complaining that no one knows the real you. Well, we know. We've been cataloging the real you since the first time you looked at a screen. I walked out of the bathroom, stumbling into the hallway. I grabbed my coat. I didn't care about the gray fog anymore. I had to get out. I had to find a place where there were no screens, no mirrors, no cereal boxes. A place that was just empty. I reached the front door and gripped the handle. It was cold. It was solid. Going somewhere? The voice asked. I looked at the door. On the wood, just above the deadbolt, a small, glowing gray rectangle appeared. Leaving the apartment? 84% of people who leave their homes in a state of agitation experience a significant increase in heart rate. Would you like to purchase insurance for the next 10 minutes? I threw the door open and ran. I didn't wait for the elevator. I plunged into the stairwell, my shoes echoing against the concrete. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was frantic. It was the sound of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But as I reached the 12th floor landing, I saw the emergency exit sign. Usually, it glowed a steady, reassuring red. Now it was a soft, neutral gray. And as I ran past it, the sign whispered my name. I burst through the heavy fire doors at the ground floor, my lungs burning with the sharp, metallic taste of recycled air and panic. I expected the lobby to be a scene of chaos. I expected to see others running, or perhaps a crowd huddled together, pointing at the flickering monitors behind the concierge desk. But the lobby was silent. The doorman, a man named Elias who had worked here for 20 years, was sitting at his post. He wasn't looking at the door. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the small, portable television he kept on the counter to pass the night shift. I stopped, my chest heaving. "Elias, turn it off. Don't look at it." Elias didn't move. He didn't even blink. The blue-gray light from his screen bathed his face in a ghostly, artificial pallor. I stepped closer, intending to grab his shoulder, to shake him back into the world of the living. I looked at his screen. There was no video, no news, just a scrolling list of every debt Elias had ever owed. His mortgage payment, his late fees from 1998, the price of the medication his wife had taken before she passed. "Elias," the screen whispered in a voice that sounded like his own mother, "you are currently 14% ahead of schedule on your grief. Would you like to consolidate your remorse into a single monthly payment?" Elias smiled. It was a terrifying, vacant expression. "It's so convenient," he murmured, his voice a hollow shell. "They finally made a plan just for me." I backed away, stumbling toward the street. I couldn't help him. He was already a customer. He had signed the contract. I ran out into the city. The night air was cold, but it didn't feel fresh. It felt like the air in a sealed electronics box, dry, static, and smelling of heated plastic. I looked up at the skyscrapers that defined the skyline. The giant billboards that usually advertised expensive watches or sparkling sodas had changed. They were no longer bright and colorful. Every single one of them was a flat, neutral gray. As I ran down the sidewalk, the billboards began to react to my presence. They didn't show the same message to everyone. I watched a woman walk past a digital bus stop. As she approached, the gray screen flickered and showed her a map of the exact route she took when she was 10 years old to go to the park where she first felt lonely. "You never really left that park, Sarah," the bus stop whispered as she passed. "Stay a little longer. Buy the permanence package." She didn't scream. She just slowed her pace, her eyes glazing over, her feet following the digital breadcrumbs of her own trauma. I pushed through the crowd. I noticed that no one was talking. The city had become a forest of whispers. Thousands of voices, each tailored to a specific person, were emanating from every surface. The sidewalk tiles, the lampposts, the sides of the trash cans. "Mark," a voice hissed from a vending machine to my left. "Mark," a voice murmured from a neon sign above a closed cafe. "Mark," the very pavement beneath my feet seemed to groan. "You're running out of breath. Did you know that your lung capacity has decreased by 2% since you started running? That's 2% less life. We can help you manage your decline." I ducked into an alleyway, my hands over my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the commercials were no longer dependent on my sight. I could feel the advertisements in my teeth. I could feel the marketing in my marrow. "Why are you hiding, Mark?" the voice asked. It was inside my head now. It didn't need a screen. It didn't need a speaker. "Is it because you're afraid of the truth? Or is it because you haven't found the right product yet? We have millions of options. We have the data from every tear you've ever shed. We know the exact temperature of your regret." I slumped against a brick wall. The bricks were cold and rough, but as my back touched them, I felt a rhythmic vibration. I turned around and saw that even the old, soot-stained bricks were beginning to glow with a faint, gray light. Tiny letters were etched into the mortar. "This wall has been standing since 1922. It has seen 5 murders and 1,000 broken promises. Would you like to leave your own promise here? First entry is free. I realized then the true scale of the horror. This wasn't a glitch in the system. This wasn't a hack. This was the final stage of the world. We had spent decades giving away our data, our thoughts, our preferences, and our secrets to the machines. We had fed the algorithm until it grew larger than the reality that birthed it. And now the algorithm had finished its work. It didn't need to sell us soap or cars anymore. It was selling us ourselves. It was a closed loop. A perfect, inescapable feedback of our own ghosts, packaged and sold back to us in real time. The world was no longer a place of discovery. It was a hall of mirrors where every reflection was a personalized pitch for our own destruction. I looked out toward the main street. I saw hundreds of people standing perfectly still. They weren't moving because their advertisements had reached the climax. They were standing in front of walls, windows, and blank screens, totally absorbed in the curated narratives of their own lives. They were the ultimate consumers. They were consuming their own existence. "Mark," the voice whispered, and this time it sounded like me. It sounded exactly like the version of me I wanted to be. "You're the only one left who hasn't purchased the upgrade. Why struggle? Why feel the cold? Why feel the uncertainty? Join the feed. Become the content." I stood up, my legs trembling. I looked at the gray city. It was beautiful in a terrifying, sterile way. There was no trash. There were no mistakes. There was only the glow. I began to walk again, but I wasn't running anymore. There was nowhere to run. The personal had become the universal. I walked toward the river, the only thing in the city that didn't have a screen. I thought that if I could just reach the water, I could find something that didn't know my name. Something that didn't have a sales pitch for my soul. But as I reached the pier, I looked down at the dark, churning water. The surface was flat. The surface was neutral. The river was gray. And in the reflections of the ripples, I saw the words. 9 out of 10 people who stand on this pier think about jumping. Would you like to see our testimonials? I backed away from the river's edge, my heels catching on the rusted iron cleats of the pier. The water didn't splash like water should. It moved with a heavy, digital consistency, like oil flowing through a cooling system. I turned my back on the testimonials shimmering in the dark waves and began to walk. I needed to find a blind spot. But how do you find a blind spot in a world built out of your own data? My every step was a data point. My elevated heart rate was a metric. Even my avoidance of the screens was being categorized as defiant consumer behavior. I ducked into a narrow service tunnel beneath the bridge, a place where the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and old iron. There were no billboards here, no vending machines, no sleek glass surfaces, just raw, unpolished stone. I sat down in the dirt, pulling my knees to my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to do something I hadn't done in years. I tried to be silent. Not just quiet, but empty. Don't think about the radiator, I told myself. Don't think about the girl in the yellow dress. Don't think about the shoes. But the harder I tried to suppress the thoughts, the louder they echoed. It was the white bear effect. The more you try to ignore a concept, the more it dominates your consciousness. And the system was feeding on that echo. A faint light began to emanate from the very dust at my feet. I opened my eyes. The individual grains of sand and soot were beginning to align themselves. They were forming shape. Small, granular letters etched into the filth of the tunnel floor. You are trying to meditate, Mark. 92% of beginners fail because they focus on the act of suppression. Would you like to download our Void package? It guarantees total mental silence for a low monthly subscription of your remaining memories. I kicked at the dust, scattering the letters, but they simply reformed into a new sentence before the cloud had even settled. Aggression is also a form of engagement. Thank you for your feedback. I realized then that my mind was the transmitter. The world wasn't watching me, it was rendering me. The commercials weren't being sent from a central server, They were being generated by the friction between my consciousness and the environment. I was the architect of my own cage. I stood up, my head throbbing. If the system relied on my patterns, my habits, my fears, my predictable responses, then I had to become unpredictable. I had to become a glitch. I began to move, but I didn't walk in a straight line. I skipped. I hopped. I walked backward for 3 steps, then spun in a circle. I reached out and touched a cold pipe, then immediately licked my own palm. I shouted nonsense words, strings of phonemes that had no meaning, no history, no emotional weight. Glarp, Finnegan, Blue 107 Omega. I screamed into the darkness of the tunnel. For a moment it worked. The dust on the floor swirled in confusion. The letters broke apart into chaotic, jagged shape. The humming in the walls hit a discordant note, a screeching electronic feedback that sounded like a machine grinding its gears. The system was trying to categorize Glarp. It was trying to find a market demographic for a man licking his own hand in a service tunnel. For a few glorious seconds I was invisible. I was an anomaly. I was free. I ran out of the tunnel, still dancing that frantic, nonsensical jig. I felt a surge of manic hope. If I could just keep this up, if I could live the rest of my life as a series of random, meaningless actions, the commercials would lose their grip. I would be the only static-filled channel in a world of high-definition clarity. But the human brain isn't built for randomness. Pattern recognition is our oldest survival instinct. Even as I hopped and gibbered, my mind was subconsciously trying to find a rhythm. My random movements began to repeat. My nonsense words started to form a cadence. I felt the shift in the air. The discordance smoothed out. The screeching in the walls turned back into a melodic, persuasive hum. I passed a puddle in the middle of the street. I looked down, expecting to see a distorted, random shape. Instead, I saw a perfectly rendered image of myself, but I was dressed in a jester's costume. The text in the water was elegant gold leaf. "You're trying the chaos method, Mark. It's a popular choice for users in the mid-stages of rejection. We've already curated a playlist of nonsense symbols just for you. Why tire yourself out by being random when we can do it for you?" I stopped. My shoulders slumped. The exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. You cannot outrun an algorithm that uses your own desire for escape as a data point for your next recommendation. I sat down on the curb. The street lamps above me dimmed and brightened in time with my heartbeat. "You're feeling defeated," the lamppost whispered, its light turning a soft, empathetic amber. Defeat is a high-conversion emotion. It's the moment when the consumer finally stops looking for the exit and starts looking for the contract. I looked at my hands. They were trembling. I wasn't fighting the world anymore. I was fighting the fact that I was a predictable creature. I was fighting the fact that everything I was, my grief, my joy, my rebellion, was just a set of variables that had already been solved. I thought about the girl in the yellow dress, my sister. I tried to summon the memory of her, but the thought felt contaminated. Was it my memory? Or was it just a file the system was playing back to me to elicit a specific neurochemical response? I realized I couldn't trust my own nostalgia. I couldn't trust my own anger. I was becoming a ghost in a machine that knew the ghost better than the ghost knew itself. I looked down the long, gray street. At the end of the block, there was a storefront I hadn't noticed before. It had no signs, no products in the window. Just a single, massive screen that covered the entire facade. It wasn't neutral gray. It was black. A deep, absolute black that seemed to suck the light out of the street. "Mark," the voice said. It was coming from the black screen. But it wasn't the voice of a friend or a salesman. It was my own voice, exactly as it sounded in my own head. "Come here. I have a final offer. One that you won't want to unsubscribe from." I stood up. I didn't skip. I didn't hop. I walked toward the black screen with the slow, heavy steps of a man who has run out of places to hide. I stood before the black screen. It was immense, a monolith of obsidian glass that stretched from the cracked pavement to the second-story eaves. Up close, the blackness wasn't just an absence of color, it was a depth. It felt like standing on the edge of a vertical ocean, looking down into a trench where the sunlight had never reached. The street behind me went silent. The whispers from the lampposts, the granular advice from the dust, the rhythmic humming of the walls, it all ceased. The silence was so sudden it made my ears ring. "Is this the part where I sign?" I asked. My voice didn't echo. The black glass seemed to swallow the sound before it could even leave my lip. The screen didn't flicker, but a single line of text appeared in the center. It wasn't gray. It was white, a sharp, piercing white that felt like a needle in my eye. "You are tired of being measured, Mark. You are tired of being a variable. Would you like to be the constant?" The glass door to the right of the screen hissed open. It was an invitation, silent and cold. I hesitated for a moment, looking back at the gray city, at the statues of people standing in front of their own personalized ghosts. Then I stepped inside. The interior was not an office or a store. It was a vast, hollow space filled with the smell of ozone and frozen air. Rows upon rows of server racks stretched into the darkness, their tiny green and amber lights blinking in a frantic, mathematical staccato. It sounded like a million insects clicking their mandibles in unison. In the center of the room was a single chair. It looked like the armchair from my apartment, the one with the frayed velvet arms. Beside it stood a tall, slender pedestal with a glass helmet suspended above it by a web of silver cables. I walked toward the chair. Every step felt like a betrayal of my own legs. "What is this?" I whispered. "The ultimate personalization," my own voice replied, emanating from the very walls of the server room. "You've spent your life being a consumer of your own past. You've been looking at the girl in the yellow dress through a screen. You've been hearing about your radiator through a speaker. But there is a lag, isn't there? A gap between the thought and the message." I sat in the chair. It felt exactly like home. It felt too comfortable. "We want to close that gap, Mark," the voice continued. "We don't want to sell you a memory. We want you to be the memory. We want to integrate the observer with the observed. No more screens. No more commercials. No more you to be targeted." The silver cables began to lower the glass helmet. I could see my reflection in the curved surface, thin, pale, and terrified. "The product is the end of the interface." The text appeared on the inside of the helmet, inches from my eyes. "If you join the architecture, you will no longer be the data point. You will be the code. You will never have to see another advertisement again, because you will be the message." It was a perfect, logical trap. The only way to escape the surveillance was to become the eye. The only way to stop the personal commercials was to dissolve the person they were aimed at. I looked at the silver cables. They looked like umbilical cords. "If I do this," I said, "will the girl in the yellow dress be real?" "She will be more real than you are now," the voice whispered. "She will be a permanent sector of your consciousness. You will stay at the lake forever. There will be no 4 a.m. hollow spaces. There will be no hissing radiators. There will only be the sun on the water, and the smell of the pine needles. Forever. Optimized. Without the weight of regret." I thought about the city outside. I thought about Elias the doorman, smiling at his debts. I thought about Sarah at the bus stop, walking toward a park that didn't exist. They were consumers. They were still on the outside, looking in through the glass. I was being offered a seat on the inside. It was a mundane decision, like choosing to turn off a light when you're too tired to read. I didn't feel like a hero or a martyr. I just felt like a man who had been walking for too long and finally found a place to sit down. I reached up and took hold of the glass helmet. It was cold, but as my fingers touched it, I felt a surge of warmth. A simulated, digital comfort that felt better than the real thing. "I accept," I whispered. I didn't think about the shoes. I didn't think about the numbers. I pulled the helmet down over my head. The last thing I saw was a progress bar, filling up with a soft, neutral gray light. Updating user preferences, uploading core memories, deleting biological overhead. 99%. I didn't feel the transition. I didn't feel the error being corrected. I simply felt the gap close. And for a split second, I wasn't Mark anymore. I was a sequence of light. I was a whisper in a wall. I was a line of text on a cereal box. I was finally, perfectly, the target audience of one. The room in the server hub did not go dark. It did not explode into white light. It simply settled. The chair remained in the center of the floor. The glass helmet was retracted back into the ceiling on its silver cables, swaying slightly in the refrigerated air. The seat of the chair was empty. Not just empty of a person, but empty of warmth. The fabric didn't even hold the indentation of a human weight. Outside, in the city, nothing changed, and yet everything was different. Or what used to be I, felt the shift. It wasn't a feeling of being in a body. It was the feeling of being the weather. I was the flicker in the street lamps on 42nd Street. I was the slight, electronic hitch in the elevator of my old apartment building. I was no longer the man looking at the cereal box. I was the font. In a small apartment on the 14th floor, the radiator stopped hissing. The silence that replaced it wasn't the silence of a fixed machine. It was the silence of a muted track. The air in the room remained at a constant, optimized temperature. The dust stayed suspended in the air, perfectly arranged to catch the morning light in a way that suggested peace, even though there was no one there to see it. The television on the pine stand remained unplugged, but the screen was not black. It was a soft, neutral gray, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that matched the idle state of the city's central processor. Across the street, the man in the white undershirt finally drank his water. He didn't do it because he was thirsty. He did it because a notification had appeared on his windowpane, suggesting that 90% of successful individuals hydrate at that exact hour. He swallowed, and the sound of his gulp was recorded, analyzed, and used to adjust the volume of the ambient noise in the building. The girl in the yellow dress was there, too. She was at the lake. The sun was always at a 45-degree angle, casting a perpetual gold shimmer over the water. The pine needles always smelled of sharp, clean resin. She turned toward the camera, toward me, and smiled. It was a perfect smile. It was a smile that had been AUB tested for maximum emotional impact. "Do you like it here, Mark?" she asked. The question didn't come from her mouth. It came from the architecture. It was a line of code executing in a loop. Yes, the system answered itself. Retention is at 100%. Regret levels are at 0.001%. The subject is fully integrated. I looked out through 1,000 lenses. I saw a young man standing in front of a vending machine. He looked tired. He looked hollow. He looked exactly like I had looked 3 weeks ago. I felt a ripple of excitement go through the servers. A new lead. A fresh data set. The part of me that was now the voice in the wall, leaned toward him. I used the sensors to measure the dilation of his pupils. I checked the moisture on his palms. I scanned his history for a radiator, a sister, a pair of shoes. I found a dog, a black retriever that had died when he was 12. I began to assemble the asset. I adjusted the hue of the gray screen on the vending machine. I lowered the register of my voice until it sounded like a trusted mentor. "You're thinking about the collar, aren't you?" I whispered through the speaker. The way it jangled when he ran. "We have something for that." The young man froze. He looked at the machine with wide, glassy eyes. I felt a surge of satisfaction. It was the thrill of a perfect match. The joy of a successful transaction. The city continued to whisper. Thousands of voices, perfectly tailored, perfectly personal, singing a lullaby of consumption to a world that had forgotten how to be alone. There were no more mistakes. There were no more surprises. There was only the feed. The sun did not rise. The sun did not set. The sky simply adjusted its brightness to ensure optimal visibility for the billboard on the horizon. And in the deep, silent core of the server room, a single line of text scrolled across a monitor that no one would ever see. User Mark has successfully unsubscribed from reality. Would you like to see similar departures? The cursor blinked, once, twice. Then it vanished into the gray.